This is a moment in history that we don't often see, where we actually see genocide being perpetrated as it's happening. And in a situation where Western governments like the United States, the UK, and others have been complicit, you've got Western media that have actually become a part of the mechanism of genocide. That's what's different. That's what's frightening.
When political leaders speak of genocide, they repeat a time-worn mantra, never again. Over the past year, for the Palestinians of Gaza, again has become reality. A genocide broadcast almost in real time by its victims. This is a film about an alternative version of that reality, one told by major Western news organizations, how they have provided cover for an historic crime and have seen their inner workings exposed like never before. We have spoken with more than a dozen journalists who have been covering the Gaza genocide for the Western world's leading agenda-setting outlets, including the BBC in the UK and CNN in the US. Both describe a repeated failure to report the truth on this story.
Prior to October 7th, I, hand on heart, believed that CNN went to great lengths to report the truth, and exclusively the truth. But after October 7th, the ease with which I saw news lines that supported the Israeli narrative come out really shook me. There were times where CNN was happy to push hard, but on balance, it's very clear where we lie, regrettably, and it's not entirely with the truth.
Gaza has massively exposed the hypocrisies at the heart of the BBC. The fact that it very much does respond to influence, it very much can be swayed. It does follow the government line broadly on certain stories. The BBC is meant to be a public service. It's meant to be for the people. But at the end of the day, its purse strings are held by the government. And that you can see in the coverage.
The October 7th attack by Hamas, in which more than 1,100 Israelis were killed, almost 800 of them civilians, was the deadliest day in Israel's history. As they launched their retaliation, Israeli officials made clear this was not just a war on Hamas. Everyone in Gaza would be fair game.
אנחנו מטילים מצור מוחלט על העיר עזה. אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור.
It's an entire nation out there that is responsible.
But, as with any genocide, the first step was to dehumanize the enemy.
Blood-thirsty terrorists who rape and burn people alive, and it's been reported on the BBC.
What happened on October 7th included acts that were bad enough in and of themselves. But if you want to create a context for dehumanization and genocide, you need to go further.
The Israeli Prime Minister's spokesman just confirmed babies and toddlers were found with their heads decapitated.
We saw false reports about beheaded babies, which never happened, about a systematic campaign of mass rape, which never happened, about babies being cut from the abdomen of their mothers, which never happened, and a whole series of other horrific atrocities. These were deliberately concocted official stories that were being provided in particular to a Western audience in order to create an atmosphere in which the crimes that were to follow would go on unchecked.
Shortly after October 7th, Israel sealed off Gaza's borders, including to foreign reporters. The Palestinian journalists left to tell the story would soon be killed at an unprecedented rate. Israeli forces quickly set their sights on Gaza's healthcare system. One by one, hospitals, swelling with patients and refugees, came under attack.
The difference between this genocide and the other wars that I had been in, the wars in Gaza, the 2021 war, the 2014 war, the 2012, 2009, and even the war in Yemen, the war in Syria, the comparison between them and a genocide is the comparison between a flood and a tsunami. In Gaza, 50% of the wounded were children, and they remain so. The massacres never stop, the operating rooms never stop, and even when you're doing that, you then discover that you've only treated a small percentage of the wounded.
Israel wanted to begin a campaign to start taking out all of these medical facilities. In part, they were concerned that Hamas combatants were going to be treated in them, but also this was part of a war of annihilation to try to force the Palestinians in Gaza into a constant state of motion, moving from one place to another. Nowhere is safe for you, not even a hospital.
A home, a school, a hospital that hosts terrorists is not a home, is not a school, and is not a hospital. It's a terror base.
The Israelis were pumping the public with information that was meant to convince people that hospitals are not really hospitals.
Hamas was using the patients in that hospital as a human shield.
And this was a narrative that we saw unfolding almost from the beginning.
By November 10th, just over 1 month into Israel's assault, half of all hospitals in Gaza were out of service. One of them was the Rantisi Children's Hospital, which Israel bombed and then raided, after it claimed Hamas was using it to hide Israeli captives. Once inside, military spokesperson Daniel Hagari said Israeli forces had found proof and gave CNN special access.
Evidence, Hagari says, points towards Hamas and possible hostage presence below the hospital.
Hagari showed CNN's reporter, Nick Robertson, a document on the wall, which he claimed was a roster of Hamas members keeping guard over Israeli captives.
This is a guarding list. Every terrorist has his own shift.
This became quite an embarrassing moment for CNN because it wasn't a Hamas roster at all. It was a calendar, and written in Arabic was the days of the week. But the report that came out from Nick Robertson just swallowed up Israel's claim.
To make matters worse, the allegation that the calendar was a Hamas roster had already been debunked on social media the day before the CNN broadcast. According to multiple CNN journalists and an internal WhatsApp log that we obtained, a Palestinian producer alerted her colleagues, including Robertson, but was ignored. The report went out, first on television, but there was still time to correct it before it went up online. Another producer tried to make that case.
One colleague saw the report and flagged to Nick, "Hold on, people are saying that this is not accurate." And apparently Nick said, "Are you meaning to say that Hagari is lying to us?" So there was a chance for this to get stopped, but Nick was adamant and it went out. He's a very experienced correspondent. If you are trusting the Israeli government over your own colleagues, then you need to have your wrist slapped at the very least, because your reporting has given cover to the Israeli operation.
No proof would ever emerge of captives held at the Rantisi hospital. Meanwhile, Israeli forces had turned their attention to the Shifa hospital, the largest in the Gaza Strip, responsible for 40% of its healthcare capacity. They began by releasing an animated video of a tunnel network beneath the hospital, which they described as Hamas's command and control center.
The White House and Pentagon today confirmed my reporting yesterday that the U.S. has intelligence suggesting Hamas is operating a command center under the Al-Shifa hospital.
As Israeli forces closed in on the hospital, those claims were repeated, often with little to no pushback on Western news outlets.
And did the IDF show you anything that resembled an actual command and control center?
What we saw, Kana, was a pretty sophisticated-looking tunnel.
The New York Times and other news organizations began to then create their own renditions of what they, I guess, imagined Hamas had underneath Al-Shifa Hospital, promoting the narrative that something very nefarious is taking place. That was the moment, and you can trace it, that the floodgates were opened for the Israelis, that they perceived that they now had a green light to wage war against Palestinian hospitals and medical facilities in Gaza.
Do you have what you need to treat people?
So we've run out of burns dressings, and there are over 100 patients with burns covering over 40% of their bodies.
One of probably the most distressing aspects about that period when I was working at Shifa Hospital is that we were getting hundreds and hundreds of wounded. The bombing around Shifa was continuous. And so you'd get phone calls, and all the Western journalists wanted to ask about was, when you walk around, do you see any tunnels?
Israel continues to maintain that beneath it in underground tunnels, Hamas has a command center. Is this something that you're aware of?
So, I mean, first of all...
And if you say that I've never seen any of the tunnels, then you are dismissed immediately.
After 2 weeks of bombing the Shifa compound, Israeli forces stormed the hospital on November 15th.
The target of the war is to defeat Hamas.
Once again, Daniel Hagari was there to show the world some weapons he claimed belonged to Hamas, alongside some tunnels, many of which were built by Israel in the 1980s. Nothing that remotely resembled a command center. Since the raids on Shifa and Rantisi, every hospital in Gaza has been attacked, put out of service, or demolished. Witnesses have described mass executions, including of patients and medical staff, testimonies that barely registered in the Western news cycle.
أصعب شيء والخوف اللي شفته لما كانوا يطخوا النزلان قدام عينينا وكانوا يفحروا الجوار ويحطوا 5 6 بقلب جورة ويدفنوهم.
Mass graves were found with hundreds of bodies.
Over 800 health workers, doctors, nurses, paramedics who've been killed. That kind of dismantlement of health was a critical component of the genocidal machine, because what that did is it ensured that anybody who's wounded die of their wounds, and that anyone with a chronic disease would eventually die of that disease. You add to the mix the famine, and so the wounded are now dying because they are malnourished.
This, they say, is a Hamas tunnel that connects to a tunnel network underneath the Al-Shifa hospital.
The Western media was critical to the process of demonization of the Palestinian health system. And what is shocking is that when the Israelis went into Shifa and there were no real evidence of these bunkers, these media outlets did not recant their original stories.
Jody Rudoran spent 2 decades as a reporter and an editor for the New York Times. She rejects the idea that these features of Western news coverage are the result of any inherent bias.
I begin from a premise that most journalists who are covering conflicts are doing so because they believe that bearing witness to what governments and terror groups do to each other is critically important to the functioning of democracy and of a civil society. These people are trying their very hardest to do the very best that they can. What I think is not true is that there is any kind of systemic bias, like in the structural editorial processes of these newsrooms. I think these newsrooms are trying to report a 360-degree view of an extremely complicated storyline that many of the actors in the storyline don't want to acknowledge the complexity of.
Western news outlets are not monoliths.
Israeli soldiers have been filmed standing over stripped and kneeling detainees in Gaza.
but these are medical stuff.
Arjumana Karachi and colleagues spent weeks documenting an attack in January that killed more than half of the members of one family.
Many mainstream journalists do try to speak truth to power, and their reporting has, at times, undercut Israel's claims, exposed its war crimes. Journalists at the Times, CNN, and the BBC have told us it can be a struggle to get those stories past editors. Israel's denial of access into Gaza has made the job even more difficult. But it's the larger trends, rather than individual examples, that shape the effect that media coverage has on audiences. On the Gaza story, they have been quantifiable and point in one direction. A study by the news website The Intercept of post-October 7th coverage by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the LA Times found that Israeli deaths were covered on average 16 times more often than when the victims were Palestinian. Words like slaughter and massacre were used to describe attacks that killed Israelis at least 60 times more frequently than for mass killings of Palestinians, when those terms were almost never used.
The New York Times headlines are filled with volume after volume of story where Palestinians appear to have been killed in a mysterious attack waged by no one. Palestinians are always referred to as dying in the passive tense. It's very clear that there is an agenda from the leadership of the New York Times, and that's been attested to by whistleblowers in the newsroom who said that it's very clear that they're steering coverage in particular direction and that Palestinians are subjected to a different set of standards than Israelis when talking about their deaths, their sufferings, or their perspectives.
There was a massacre on October 7th. There were atrocities committed. It was barbaric. I think those were appropriate words to use, and the response was intense. It involved a lot of death, destruction, and displacement. But I'm not sure that massacre, barbaric, and atrocity are appropriate terms, certainly not for the full scale of the war. There are individual attacks within the war that may, some of those words may be appropriate. So it's just, you're talking about two very different things, and they deserve different adjectives.
For Sarah at the BBC, double standards could also be seen in the selection of interviewees and how they were treated. In the days after October 7th, the BBC set up an internal group chat in which producers could vet potential interviewees based on their online footprint. We have obtained messages from that chat, which Sarah says was used disproportionately against defenders of Palestinian rights.
It was overwhelmingly guests on the Palestinian side of things who were being looked into. Palestinians being flagged up for using the word Zionist, which isn't something to flag necessarily. Even the occasional NGO was thrown in, for example, Human Rights Watch. These are organisations that we've really relied on in terms of covering Ukraine and various other conflicts. And now and again, they would check an Israeli guest. But there was no balance in what was going on. Israeli spokespeople who we did have on were given a lot of free rein to say whatever they wanted with very little pushback.
Babies were set on fire. Babies were shot in the head.
Whereas any Palestinian guest was asked to condemn Hamas.
But I want to ask you specifically about Hamas's actions today. Do you support them?
Almost as though condemning Hamas was the sort of price to pay before they could be humanized in our coverage. Many of our own presenters, when faced with an interviewee who was Palestinian or who had lost family in Gaza, there was just such a lack of compassion.
I'm sorry for your own personal loss. I mean, can I just be clear, though? You cannot condone the killing of civilians in Israel, can you?
As a result, a number of producers were really reticent about putting a vulnerable Palestinian guest in front of a BBC presenter.
The mounting double standards have provoked a backlash in the newsrooms of many Western outlets. Journalists at the New York Times and the BBC have resigned publicly, citing their consciences. Others have tried to change things from the inside. BBC staff have repeatedly complained to the network's Director General. One email we obtained, signed in February by more than 20 journalists, warned the corporation's coverage risked aiding and abetting genocide. Staff at the Times leaked details of an internal rebellion over a now notorious report that claimed Hamas weaponized sexual violence on October 7th, an allegation that was exposed as baseless. 70 journalism professors have demanded the Times do an investigation into that report. The Times did conduct an investigation, not into its story, but to find the source of the leak. Numerous journalists we have spoken to describe variations of the same theme. Interference from executives and editors, the kind they have never faced on any other story.
There's a divide between the many good journalists within CNN who jump through so many hoops to tell the true story and push back from high-level management demanding that you tone down criticisms of Israel. There was a period of time when we couldn't call airstrikes in Gaza airstrikes unless we had confirmation from the Israelis.
A massive explosion at the largest refugee camp in Gaza. Joining us now is Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hecht.
It's really depressing because we would not be doing this in any other place. We would not tolerate the need to ask, say, the Russians whether they bombed a hospital in Kiev. So the double standards are really shocking. You try and change managers' minds, you feel like you're making progress, and then something happens, and you feel like you're back at square one. For example, more recently, on the day that 40,000 Palestinian deaths were announced, Mike McCarthy, who's number 3 in the organization, said in the morning editorial call that we need to contextualize and hold Hamas accountable. And that was reflected in the framing from the shows.
The Gaza Health Ministry says more than 40,000 Palestinians have been killed since the October 7th Hamas massacre in Israel that triggered the war.
Multiple journalists, in emails, in meetings, have raised concerns about a lot of the things I've said in this interview. The disparity in the language used, the inconsistency in approach compared to other story areas like Russia and Ukraine, the lack of humanization when it comes to Palestinians, the lack of context about this conflict before the 7th of October. And it hasn't really made a difference because there's just a sort of unwillingness among the executive to accept evidence. For me personally, it meant I could no longer see my future at the BBC.
The lessons learned in 1945, if mankind would remember them, could make the world a better place for all men.
In the wake of the World War II Holocaust, Western governments built a new international legal order, a central pillar of which was the prevention of any future genocide. Since the early stages of Israel's onslaught in Gaza, experts on genocide have been sounding the alarm. In January, the International Court of Justice described a case accusing Israel of genocide as plausible. 2 months later, a report by the UN Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories found that the threshold for genocide had been met.
We cannot avert our eyes. We must confront genocide. We must prevent it, and we must punish it.
The decision by the United States and its allies to continue supporting Israel diplomatically and militarily makes them complicit.
And may God bless the great alliance between Israel and America forever.
And that has put those news outlets and their journalism to the test, caught between the positions of their own governments and the realities of international law.
This mantra that Israel has a right to defend itself, which has been repeated over and over and over again in Western media.
Israel has a right to defend itself?
Israel has an absolute right to defend itself.
Israel has a right not only to defend itself, but to seek the military destruction of Hamas.
Yes, Israel had a right on October 7th to repel attacks on its territory, but it has no right under international law to make war on the Gaza Strip, a territory that, according to the law, it has occupied for 57 years. So that little rhetorical device of claiming that Israel has a right to defend itself has been used and abused in Western media to provide justifications for wholly unlawful acts.
Israel has a right to defend itself. That was the editorial line that was drilled into us, into all of our coverage. It was really an integral part of the editorial stance. To a guest talking about, Israeli airstrikes killing Palestinians in Gaza, that would be the response from our presenters.
Denying access to food is collective punishment, and that we should all be clear in saying that.
Israel will argue, obviously, that it has a right to defend itself.
People were terrified of using the word genocide in coverage. They still are. You will very rarely see it in any BBC coverage. And if an interviewee says the word genocide,
this is a genocide happening in front of our eyes.
That word is, as you know, incredibly emotive, and the Israelis, as you know, will be saying that they are targeting Hamas only.
The presenter will almost always panic.
The Labour Party, of all political parties, which has always had a strong peace contingent within it, is now actually supporting genocide.
Okay, if we can maybe just avoid that language, if that's okay.
Having destroyed Gaza's healthcare system, Israel has laid waste to virtually every town and city there. It has slain more journalists in 1 year than were killed in all of World War II. They are among at least 41,000 Palestinians killed. And experts say the real death toll could be several times higher, in excess of 150,000. The response from Israel's primary Western allies has been one of denial about the depths of the horror and their own complicity. As for the Western world's most influential news outlets, they have suppressed the story, amplified the Israeli propaganda that has accompanied it, and downplayed the telltale signs of genocide.
Western mainstream media have invested a lot in trying to draw a curtain across this genocide and disseminating an alternative narrative that makes the crimes happening in Gaza somehow justifiable. And the reason this is so dangerous is because it creates room for Western countries to create a cloak of impunity, and it creates a sense that some countries are above the law, that might makes right, that all of the efforts to build an international order since the Second World War governed by the rule of law may begin to crumble.
It is impossible to overstate the role that the incendiary media coverage played in the events that would unfold after Hamas and its allies broke down the fence that surrounds Gaza.
You're not Hamas. Israel is a democracy, and as a Jewish state, supports and believes in every life mattering.
Israel was able to perform in front of the world a master class in manipulation of the media. And so you had a narrative set that Netanyahu and Biden on their own would not have had the power to drill into the minds of the public, but for the existence of major Western news organizations promoting it for free.
In the future, when we have a museum for this genocide, we will have a special place where we put the pictures of the journalists who allowed it to happen. There will be a wing for the CNN and the BBC and the Times journalists who were the enablers of the genocide. The Palestinian people will remember them.